Hi, Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us as we continue our study in the book of 1 Samuel. This week we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 25, where we're going to be introduced to a foolish man and his wise wife. If you've been reading through 1 Samuel, you'll remember that in chapter 25, David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but he didn't. And after realizing that David could have killed him, but didn't, Saul seems to be softened somewhat. The last verse of chapter 24, verse 22, says that Saul went to his home, presumably in Gibeah, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. This may have been a place or a cave or some fortified situation that they had either found or made for themselves, probably in the wilderness near Ziph. Now, even though Saul is back home, David remains far away from home. He preferred to stay in this stronghold. Maybe he's thinking, since he is aware of Saul's violent lapses, that maybe this is only temporary. He knows that there are some who are willing to give him up. We had read about the Ziphites who had told Saul where he was, and Saul was willing to act on that information and go after him. And so David maybe doesn't really trust that Saul is going to stay in this fragile, sane frame of mind for long. At any rate, David stays on the move, but don't forget, he's got a growing following. So far, he's up to 600 men who were with him, and he's got to find some way to provide for these guys, to feed them. That's a lot of people to provide for out in the wilderness. And so we're going to see later on in this chapter, 1 Samuel 25, where David considers, well, protecting shepherds. Maybe that'll give them opportunity to have some food. But before that happens, we read about Samuel's death in chapter 25, verse 1. It says, "Then Samuel died, and all Israel gathered together and mourned for him, and buried him at his house in Ramah. David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran." Since anointing David back in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, Samuel hasn't been heard from much. The narrative has revolved mostly around David's rise upward and Saul's slide downward. And while David was on the run in the southern desert, his friend and counselor and mentor, Samuel, dies, making it that much harder, perhaps, for Saul and David to ever be really fully reconciled. It says that Samuel is mourned by all in verse 1 of chapter 25. For Israel, it was the end of an era. Samuel represented the last of the judges, even though his sons are called judges. Samuel is truly the last judge. He had a circuit where he would ride from city to city, would judge. He's also a prophet. But he was a leader. And he was a leader when Israel sorely needed some leadership. And it was his leadership that helped the transition from disunity to a more cohesive nation, from a lawless nation to a somewhat united monarchy. And while Saul, you recall before, had built a monument to himself at Carmel, it says here that Samuel is simply buried at his house in Ramah. But it probably wasn't all of Israel that mourned Samuel. I'm sure David did as well. David withdraws further. The end of verse 1 tells us that he arose and he went down to the wilderness of Paran. Now, perhaps that signifies for us that he had gone further south or down in elevation, but it maybe also indicates that he was receding further and further away. He was withdrawing. Did David, after all, think that Samuel's death and the loss of his influence might mean greater danger from Saul? And when you think about it, who owes more to Samuel than Saul and David? His death, Samuel's, comes just as Saul realizes too late the truth of Saul's or Samuel's rebuke, that in that message that the kingdom was going to be taken from him and given to a neighbor who was better than him. And having what appears to be one more reason for despair, David journeys further into the desert and further away from Saul. And maybe it's this loss that has David acting in such an un-David-like way in this chapter. And you'll see that as we go along. We're going to be introduced to a man named Nabal and his hostility. Now, Nabal is in Maon. That's what verse 2 tells us. There was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. And the man was very rich. And he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And it came about that he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now, the man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. And the woman was intelligent and beautiful in appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his dealings, and he was a Calebite. And we'll stop there for a second. Nabal and Abigail are opposites, about as opposites as two people can be. And maybe it's proof that that old adage is true, opposites attract. Well, they're married to one another, but they're as different as night and day. It tells us that Nabal, which is an interesting name, we're going to find out that he lives up to that name. The name Nabal is from the root word for fool or foolish. And of course, we see the fool or the foolish man a lot in the book of Proverbs. But this gives us kind of a darker side to his foolishness. It says that he's not only foolish, but he's harsh and evil. The NIV says he's surly and mean. And his interaction with others was apparently rough. He was a stubborn man. He was a thoughtless individual, which was a shame to his heritage as a Calebite. You remember that Caleb was one of those two spies who years ago had gone into the land to spy it out, and were trying to, along with Joshua, convince the people, the Israelites, to go in and take the land. Well, there's one sense in which being a Calebite would have been a good thing. But some have suggested that since the word Caleb comes from the word for dog, that maybe that's what it means. Dogs weren't looked on very well in that time. They were scavengers. So it's either, in any way, it shines an unfavorable light on who he is, the kind of guy that he is. Now, Abigail, we're told, is intelligent and beautiful. And the intelligence here doesn't only refer to her intellectual capacity. It's a word that's often used in connection with insight into God's will, into God's morality. In fact, it's the same kind of word that's used to describe David as wise in chapter 18 and verse 50. So maybe these words that connect both Abigail and David are setting us up for the future connection that we'll see here in chapter 25 between David and Abigail. Well, David makes a polite request. In verse 4, it says, David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. And so David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, Go up to Carmel, visit Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall say, Have a long life, peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. Now I've heard that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we have not insulted them, nor have they missed anything all the days they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they'll tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we have come on a festive day. Please give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David. When David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words in David's name. Then they waited. And we'll stop there. Now, I want you to notice some things about David's request. First of all, it's polite and respectful. He instructs his men to extend this blessing to Nabal and his household. And in verse 6 it says, this is the blessing. Have a long life. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. That's about the highest way you can bless somebody in ancient Israel. David was not only treading carefully, he was being respectful to Nabal. But David's request was also timely. Sheep shearing time was a festive time. It was time to anticipate the rewards from shepherding, and hospitality was the order of the day. And knowing that since sheep shearing time was a festive time and that there would probably be lots of food available for the shearers, David might have thought, well, this is the perfect time to try and convince the man whom we have been protecting that it would be good to share some of that with us. But David's request is also logical and appropriate. One would expect some kind of return for providing protection and care. In fact, David says here in verse 7 that we've not insulted your guys, nor have they missed anything. All the days we're in Carmel. He says, ask your young men and they'll tell you. Well, when sheep were considered part of one's wealth, and we're told here that Nabal's wealth in sheep is considerable. Verse 2 says he has 3,000 sheep. Well, you would expect that there would have been some sheep rustling going on, that there would have been some sheep stealers who would look for opportunity to do that. And David watched over the shepherds that were watching over the flock of Nabal. And it's entirely appropriate that David would have asked for some return for doing that job. It's reasonable that he would have done that. But even his request is reasonable. He doesn't ask for a lot. He doesn't even demand anything. In fact, at the end of verse 8, David has his men say, please give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David. He's not asking for the best stuff they have. He's just asking for whatever they want to give him. Well, Nabal doesn't take much time to consider it. He makes a hasty refusal. In verse 10, it says, but Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who were each breaking away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered for my shears and give it to men whose origin I don't know? So David's young men retraced their way and went back, and they came and told him according to all these words. David said to his men, each of you gird on his sword. So each man girded on his sword, and David also girded on his sword, and about 400 men went up behind David, while 200 stayed with the baggage. Now, I want you to notice some things that are inherent in Nabal's refusal, just as good things were inherent in David's request. First of all, Nabal responds in a way that fits the description we read about him before. Remember, he was harsh and evil, or surly and mean. Well, the way he responds is mean and surly, just as you would expect to be consistent with that kind of a guy. But his refusal was also dismissive. He says, who is David and who is the son of Jesse? You recall from your past reading that phrase, the son of Jesse, is a phrase that Saul himself used in a derogatory way towards David. So maybe Nabal is a man who supports Saul. And there's no doubt that probably he would have heard about David, would have known who he is, but he doesn't care. He's dismissive as to who David is. And we also see that his refusal is selfish. In verse 11, I want you to notice how many times the word my appears in Nabal's refusal. He says, shall I then take my bread, my water, my wheat that I have slaughtered for my shears, and give it to men whom I do not know? His words are reminiscent of another fellow who had an eye problem. Back in Luke chapter 12, Jesus told the story of a man whose profit from his farming was so big that he had to tear down his barns and build bigger barns, and he kept using the word I. Remember that? Well, Nabal is that kind of a selfish man. But his refusal was also going to be trouble. David apparently felt that Nabal had returned evil for good. In fact, if we jump ahead to verse 21, that's exactly what David claims he has done. Surely in vain I have guarded all that this man has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. David is insulted. And because of that, verse 13 says that David ordered his men to put on their swords, and they're going after Nabal and everything that he has with 400. 200 men are staying behind. David apparently thinks that 400 will be enough to overwhelm him. And certainly that's a good-sized army of men who were going down after shepherds, after all. Now, this is troubling, not only for Nabal, but for David, because this kind of attitude is completely out of character for what we've seen from David so far. But that intelligent, beautiful woman, Abigail, has a plan. In verse 14, it says, one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, behold, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he scorned them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we were not insulted, nor did we miss anything as long as we went with them, while we were in the fields. They were a wall to us both by night and by day, all the time we were with them tending the sheep. Now therefore, know and consider what you should do, for evil is plotted against our master, and against all his household, and he is such a worthless man, that no one can speak to him. Then Abigail hurried, and took 200 loaves of bread, and 2 jugs of wine, and 5 sheep already measured, already prepared, and 5 measures of roasted grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. She said to her young man, go on before me. Behold, I'm coming after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. We'll stop there. I want you to notice how Abigail begins to put this plan together that's going to fend off what has all the makings of a terrible murderous massacre. First of all, notice that she listens patiently. She listens to what this young man has to say. She listened where her husband did not. She's willing to hear out this young man. And then she considers carefully. She knows the hard-headedness of her worthless husband. In fact, the servant even admits to it. In verse 17, he's such a worthless man that no one can speak to him. Well, who would know that better than his wife, Abigail? And so she begins to thoughtfully and carefully concoct a plan. And that plan is one in which she plans generously. We're told in verse 18 that she takes 200 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 measures of roasted grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. All of this all together is going to be enough for David and his men for sure. The quantity of food that she gathers says a couple of things. One, it speaks about the festivity of the event, that all these delicacies and all this good food is ready to go. But 2, it also speaks to the fact that not only is this ready for the men that her husband employs, but her willingness to take it in order to take care of David and his men. She knows what she's doing, and she knows the trouble that she's trying to head off. And so she goes to David to intercede on behalf of her husband, even though her husband doesn't even know it. In verse 20, it says, it came about as she was riding on her donkey, coming down by the hidden part of the mountain, that behold, David and his men were coming down toward her. So she met them. Now David had said, "Surely in vain I have guarded all that this man has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. May God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave as much as one male of any who belong to him." When Abigail saw David, she hurried and dismounted from her donkey, and fell on her face before David, and bowed herself to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my lord, be the blame. And please let your maidservant speak to you, and listen to the words of your maidservant. Please do not let my lord pay attention to this worthless man, Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. Now therefore, my lord, as Yahweh lives, and as your soul lives, since Yahweh has restrained you from shedding blood, and from avenging yourself by your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek evil against my lord be as Nabal. Now let this gift, which your maidservant has brought to my lord, be given to the young men who accompany my lord. Please forgive the transgression of your maidservant, for Yahweh will certainly make for my lord an enduring house, because my lord is fighting the battles of Yahweh, and evil will not be found in you all your days. Should anyone rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, then the life of my lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with Yahweh your God, for the lives of your enemies he will sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when Yahweh does for my lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and appoints you ruler over Israel, this will not cause grief or a troubled heart to my lord, both by having shed blood without cause, and by my lord having avenged himself. When Yahweh deals well with you, my lord, then remember your maidservant." We'll stop there. We can see that David is on the warpath. All the time that they had spent guarding Nabal's shepherds and sheep, David feels is just a waste of time. And now he's been spurned and he's angry. He wants revenge. He wants vengeance. And so he's ready to rain down terror on Nabal. In fact, so much so that he's ready to massacre Nabal's entire household and servants to satisfy his revenge. But Nabal, or rather Abigail, comes out to intercede. And she does so in a way that's consistent with a woman who is intelligent and beautiful as much on the inside as she is apparently on the outside. First of all, notice that she intercedes respectfully. In verses 23 and 24, it says that she falls on her face before David and bows herself to the ground. Verse 24 says she fell at his feet. She is prostrating herself before David. She offers David the respect that her husband refused to give to him. She even addresses David over and over again as my lord, my lord, my lord. She addresses him as a superior. But she also intercedes reasonably. In verse 25, she says, don't pay any attention to him because he is a worthless man. You remember before in verse 17, it was the servant who told Abigail that his boss, Nabal, was a worthless man. Well, Abigail already knew that. And she tells David that he lives up to his name. Nabal is his name and foolishness is his game. That's the kind of guy that he is. So without excusing him, she acknowledges her husband's blunder and she takes the blame herself. Did you see that there in verse 24? On me alone, my lord, she says, be the blame. She claims that blame because she didn't hear David's man make the request when he came to Nabal. But she also intercedes piously. Several times she refers to God by his name, Yahweh, again and again and again. She appeals to David that God was helping him to keep from shedding blood, and David must remember that he's on God's side. In this way, he can return good for evil, even though David believed that evil had been returned for his good. And so it's a way for him to remember just how he had been with Saul. Remember, Saul intended evil for David, but David had the opportunity to kill Saul in that cave and didn't do it. So she's appealing to God, but she's also appealing to David's obligation to God. And in so doing, she intercedes hopefully. In verses 28 through 31, it's evident that she knows something about David's future reign. Even if Nabal played dumb about it or just refused to acknowledge David, the future king of Israel, she seems to know something about it. She foresees blessing and protection in David, and that God will do, as she says, all the good that he has spoken concerning David and his reign as king. In fact, if you look at verse 29, she says, should anyone rise up to pursue you and to take your life, then the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with Yahweh your God, but the lives of your enemies he will sling out as from the hollow of a sling. She's telling David, don't forget, God's going to take care of your enemies. He's already anointed you. You're going to be king. So God's going to make sure that that happens. But she says, don't let this situation that you're about to embark on be a cause, as she says in verse 31, for grief or a troubled heart to my Lord. She's appealing to David in every way that she possibly can. And this whole speech that Abigail makes is a model of courtesy and persuasive reason that heads off a very bad situation. And she actually performs some pretty socially outrageous actions, at least for that time. She negates her husband's intention for the matter. Don't forget, that was a patriarchal period where the man wore the pants in the family and his word was law in the household. She assumes moral culpability for actions in which she took no part. The whole thing was entirely her husband's fault, and yet she's willing to take the blame, and she's willing to give away part of the family fortune as a gift to one of her husband's enemies. But her willingness to go against the cultural mores of the day saves the day for herself and for her household. Let's read about David's restraint in verse 32 and following. It said, then David said to Abigail, blessed be Yahweh God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me, and blessed be your discernment, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from bloodshed and from avenging myself on your hand, or rather avenging myself by my own hand. Nevertheless, as Yahweh God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from harming you, unless you would come quickly to meet me, surely there would have not been left to Nabal until the morning light as much as one male. So David received from her hand what she had brought, and said to her, go up to your house in peace. See, I have listened to you and granted your request. Notice how David blesses Abigail. First, he blesses her discernment. She rightly judged his intention, his motives, and the disastrous outcome. And he realizes her persuasion. Verse 35, he says, I have listened to you and granted your request. He sees now, I think, that his actions would have been bound up in petty revenge. And it's obvious that David appreciated this woman far more than her foolish husband does. But David also blesses God. David sees God's providence. He sees the hand of God in the better outcome and in his use of Abigail in fending off would have been a decidedly ungodly deed for David. And notice the contrast here between David and Saul. Saul slaughtered an entire community of priests because he thought they had offended him in somehow being in cahoots with David. Saul was willing to kill an entire community of priests because of his thirst for revenge. David here spares those who had really and truly offended him. We read a little more about David and Abigail in the following closing verses of chapter 25. But first, we read about how Abigail's husband Nabal gets his just deserts in a very, very strange way. Look with me in verse 36. Then Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she did not tell him anything at all until the morning light. But in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, so that he became as a stone. And about 10 days later, Yahweh struck Nabal, and he died. We'll stop there for a minute. Let's notice how Nabal feasts and then faints. The description of the feast again indicates that he had more than enough to share with David and his men. In his selfishness, he is completely oblivious to the need of others. And when, don't forget, David was on his way to kill him, and there would have been no fight. It would have been a slaughter because Nabal and his household are partying it up, right? And Nabal is too drunk probably to even try to do anything about the situation. So it would have been just a massacre. It would have been a bloodbath. The news of his near death ironically brings him closer to it. He has what looks like a stroke, and he lingers for 10 days, and then he finally dies. It says God struck him, and then he died. Notice some things we learn about Nabal. We know that he wasn't a man who honored God. He wasn't a man who listened to his wife, no matter how wise or intelligent she may have been. He was a man who let his excesses control him. He was drunk to the point of not even being able to be spoken to that night. He was a man who had a hard heart. It tells us there in verse 37 that when he had been struck by the truth of what his wife told him, it says he became as a stone. But his heart was already stone cold before that. And of course, as Abigail said, Nabal lived up to his name. What a sad end for a man whom God has blessed so abundantly. He was rich because God made it possible for him to be. But he was also rich in that he had a wise, intelligent, beautiful wife who could have been his helpmeet all the days of his life if he'd have just turned first to God and then to his wife. Well, David praises God and then proposes to Abigail. Let's keep reading. When David heard that Nabal was dead, verse 39, he said, "Blessed be Yahweh, who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from evil. Yahweh has also returned the evil doing of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent a proposal to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they spoke to her, saying, "David has sent us to take you as his wife." She arose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, "Behold, your maidservant is a maid to wash the feet of my Lord's servants." Then Abigail quickly arose and rode on a donkey with her 5 maidens who attended her, and she followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David has also taken Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both became his wives. Now Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Paltai, the son of Laish, who is from Galim. We'll stop there. It's the end of the chapter. Notice some things here that we see. In David's praise, he recognizes God's right to administer justice. He says that God is the one who has returned the evil doing. See, David is ready to take revenge. But just as Scripture says, God is the one who says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And so David saw that God did exactly that. There are several Psalms, Psalm 7, Psalm 140, Psalm 141, that are penned by David that contain expressions like the one who digs a pit is going to be the one to fall into it. The one who sets a trap is going to be the one that gets ensnared by it. Well, we see that with Nabal. God is the one who returned trouble to him. And David's proposal gains him a wise wife. Several times in the book of Proverbs, we are introduced or at least referred to a good wife, a good woman. A good wife who can find, the proverb asks. Some think here that because she's a fellow member of the tribe of Judah, that David was acting as a sort of kinsman redeemer. There's no indication from the text about that, but others see marriage to Abigail as something that allowed David to fulfill any responsibility that he might have felt for protecting Abigail, maybe from Nabal's cohorts or his servants, or maybe even from Saul. Don't forget, Saul is prone to revenge against people whom he thinks help David. So there's that. And still others see a kind of prelude to David's weakness for feminine charms. Of course, we're thinking already far ahead to his dalliance with Bathsheba in the book of 2 Samuel. David's only wife till now was Saul's daughter, Michal. It says in verse 44 that Saul had remarried her to, or at least given her to another man. And that may have been a show of hatred against David. It might have also been a political move, since removing his wife from his son-in-law might have been with the intention to destroy even more any claim that David might have on the throne as Saul's son-in-law. But at some point, it also tells us here that David had taken another wife, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and she's going to have the distinction of becoming the mother of David's firstborn son, Amnon, who is going to be trouble for David's household later on. As we come to the end of this episode here, we see that David survives another test of his baser instinct. And David's speech here towards the end of this chapter shows that he's beginning to discover more and more the patience and restraint that are the path to Yahweh's best plan for him. Abigail's speech that she had given to David earlier explains that taking the long-term view is far more beneficial than yielding to one's immediate impulses. We know what that's like. We call it immediate gratification, right? Well, this is all about delayed gratification. Letting God's plan work itself out and letting yourself be, or at least David allowing himself to be used by God in a way that not only makes David a better man, but works out the plan that God had all along. Well, we'll be looking later on at another opportunity that David has to yet again take care of Saul. But we'll leave that till next time. And I hope to see you then. God bless you.